Supposed Bible contradiction. How many angels or men were at the tomb? Skeptics will note there are inconsistencies with what happened on Sunday morning when Jesus rose from the dead. Specifically, with regards to who was at the tomb to announce that Jesus had risen. Mark says it was a man, Matthew says it was an angel, Luke says there were two men, and John says there were two angels. Now, despite this appearing as an inconsistency on the surface, if we study the details more, we will find this hardly qualifies as a contradiction. First, the fact that Matthew and Mark only mention one being there instead of two doesn't mean there was a contradiction. In the ancient world, authors often employed a literary device called spotlighting. Mike Licona defines this as when an author focuses attention on a person so that the person's involvement in a scene is clearly described, whereas mention of others who were likewise involved is neglected. The author has shined his literary spotlight on that person. He then goes on to cover several examples of spotlighting happening throughout the lives of Plutarch. For example, in the life of Julius Caesar, Plutarch mentions that many of the conspirators were wounded in the process of assassinating Julius Caesar. But in the life of Brutus, Plutarch spotlights Brutus's wounds without mentioning that many of the others were also wounded. In the life of Cato Minor, Plutarch says that Cato rescued Cicero and others from the younger Pompey. But in the life of Cicero, only Cicero is spotlighted as being saved. In the life of Brutus, Brutus orders a man named Hortensius to execute Gaius. But in the life of Antony, only Brutus is mentioned as executing Gaius. Likewise, in the life of Brutus, Plutarch says Antony retaliated by killing Hortensius. But in life of Antony, Antony orders Hortensius to be killed by someone else. So Matthew and Mark are probably just spotlighting the angel that spoke and didn't find it necessary in their ancient cultural context to mention there was another one with him. There is no rule that the gospel authors had to mention literally everyone involved in every incident they report. Matthew and Mark probably only felt it necessary to mention the angel that spoke to get the story across. With regards to two gospel authors saying they were men and the other two saying they were angels, this is hardly an issue. Luke, for example, does refer to them as men, but later in the very same chapter, he also says they were angels. Mark describes the man as in a white robe delivering divine revelation. Throughout the New Testament and in other Jewish works, angelic and divine beings are often described as being in white and appearing at random to deliver divine revelation. They can also be described as appearing as men. So it is hardly a problem to suggest Mark is claiming an angel spoke to the women who appeared as a man in a white robe. Both Matthew and John also describe the angels as being dressed in white. Skeptics also allege that Matthew contradicts the other Gospels in where one of the angels was sitting. The other three suggest the angels were inside the tomb, but Matthew 28:2 says one angel sat on a stone outside of the tomb. However, Matthew might also imply the angel moved and that time had passed from when the stone had rolled away to when the women arrived. He also says the angel stated, "Come, see the place where he lay," which implies the angels moved and one was speaking from inside the empty tomb. Another objection is Luke says the angels were standing, but John and Mark say they were sitting. But the Greek word can be translated to mean appear or to be present. It does not necessarily mean to stand. Skeptics will also note what the angel says to the women is different in each of the synoptics. But within the ancient cultural context, exact wording was not necessary, and authors were expected to paraphrase and summarize to help readers better understand what was happening. The 4th century scholar Theon of Alexandria explicitly notes these techniques were employed quite often and were well within the bounds of historiography. To quote, "All ancient writers seem to have used paraphrase in the best possible way, rephrasing not only their own writings, but those of each other." Mike Licona comments on his works and says, Theon discusses how there is a substantial amount of flexibility involved when reconstructing speeches, and the imagination of the writer is welcomed. However, the narration must be credible and suitable to the speakers, audience members, and occasion. Theon discusses other techniques by which one may vary a narrative, sometimes as making a straightforward statement, and sometimes as doing something more than making a factual statement, and sometimes in the form of questions, and sometimes as things we seek to learn about, and sometimes as things about which we are in doubt, and sometimes as making a command, sometimes expressing a wish, and sometimes swearing to something, sometimes addressing the participants, sometimes advancing suppositions, sometimes using dialogue. In other words, ancient writers could rephrase or paraphrase as they saw fit to best pass on the narration. Statements would be turned into questions. A monologue could be turned into a dialogue. Words that could be more appropriate to pass on the message could be substituted. Because passing on the message and making sure the audience understood what happened was more important than exact wording. For example, in Plutarch's work, Life of Julius Caesar, he records that a piece of graffiti said, "You are sleeping, O Brutus, and you are not Brutus." But in Life of Brutus, Plutarch says the graffiti read as, "Brutus, you are sleeping, and you are not really Brutus." And there are many other places where paraphrasing like this happens. Again, it was about getting the message across, not exact wording. So given the ancient cultural context, the Gospel authors were well within reason to paraphrase and summarize what the angel had said to the women. Demanding exact wording is forcing our cultural context onto the ancient world. They were more concerned with passing on meaning, as that was more important in the long run. So once we move past the surface level reading of the Gospels, we can easily point out there is no real contradiction, and it is quite easy to harmonize these accounts, especially when we take into account the cultural context. Thus, this supposed contradiction can be resolved.